Before we begin, do me one favor and subscribe, because the fault I'm about to tell you about is one that most people in California have never even heard of, and yet it may be one of the most important pieces of ground in the entire state. For around 500 years, this fault has been almost completely silent. No great rupture, no major earthquake, just quiet. And in the world of earthquakes, silence is not always a comfort. Sometimes silence is exactly what should worry you the most, because a fault that has been quiet for centuries is not a fault that is safe. It is a fault that has been storing energy the entire time. So stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand why scientists watch this silent fault so closely, and why recent activity right at its most critical point has geologists paying very close attention. The fault is called the Garlock Fault. If you have heard of the San Andreas, and almost everyone has, then you already know California's most famous fault line. But running across the state, meeting the San Andreas at a crucial junction, is this second major fault that gets far less attention, even though it is one of the largest and most significant faults in all of California. The Garlock Fault stretches for roughly 250 kilometers across the southern part of the state. It forms a kind of boundary along the northern edge of the Mojave Desert, separating it from the mountains and valleys to the north. And where its western end meets the mighty San Andreas Fault, you get one of the most geologically important intersections anywhere in North America. To understand why this fault matters, and why its silence is so meaningful, you first have to understand what a fault actually is, and why California has so many of them. The surface of the Earth is not one solid shell. It is broken into enormous pieces called tectonic plates. And these plates are slowly, constantly moving. They move only a few centimeters a year, about as fast as your fingernails grow, but they never stop. California sits right on the boundary between two of these great plates. To the west is the Pacific Plate, and to the east is the North American Plate. These two plates are grinding past each other, and the San Andreas Fault is the main line along which that grinding happens. Now here is the thing about that movement. The plates want to slide past each other smoothly, but they cannot, because the rock along the fault is rough and locked together by friction. So instead of sliding freely, the two sides of the fault get stuck. But the plates behind them keep pushing. Year after year, decade after decade, the pressure builds. The rock bends and strains, storing up energy like a spring being wound tighter and tighter. And then at some point, the friction can no longer hold. The rock suddenly snaps and slips, releasing all that stored energy at once in a violent burst. That sudden release is an earthquake. The longer a fault has been locked and building strain without releasing it, the more energy it has stored, and the bigger the potential earthquake when it finally lets go. Picture bending a wooden ruler with your hands. As you push the two ends toward each other, the ruler bows and bends, and you can feel the tension building in it. For a while, it holds. The harder you push, the more energy is stored in that bend. But there is a limit. Push far enough, and the ruler suddenly snaps, and all that stored energy releases in an instant with a sharp crack. A locked fault behaves in a similar way. The slow movement of the plates is like your hands steadily pushing. The rock bends and stores the strain, holding on through friction until it reaches the point where it can hold no more. Then it breaks, and the ground lurches. The difference is that a fault is not bending over seconds in your hands. It is bending over centuries, storing up an amount of energy that no human force could ever match. There is one more detail about the Garlock and the San Andreas that is worth understanding, because it explains how they move. Both of these are what geologists call strike-slip faults, which means the two blocks of the Earth's crust slide horizontally past each other rather than one riding up over the other. Imagine placing your two hands flat on a table, palms down, side by side, and then sliding one hand toward you while the other slides away. That horizontal grinding motion is what a strike-slip fault does. Because the movement is sideways, these faults do not usually build tall mountains directly the way some other fault types do. Instead, they offset the landscape sideways over time. Features that were once lined up like the path of a stream or the edge of a ridge slowly get shifted apart over thousands of years, leaving visible clues that geologists can measure to work out how fast and how far the fault has moved. This is the key idea you have to hold on to understand why the Garlock Fault is so important. It has been locked and quiet for a very long time. Scientists study the history of earthquakes on a fault using a field called paleoseismology, which is essentially the detective work of reading the ground itself for the signatures of ancient earthquakes. They dig trenches across the fault, they examine the layers of soil and rock, and they look for the telltale marks where past earthquakes broke and shifted the ground. By dating those layers, they can build a timeline of when major earthquakes struck in the distant past, long before any written records existed. And what the paleoseismic record shows for the Garlock Fault is striking. This fault is capable of producing very large earthquakes, in the range of magnitude 7 and above. But the last time it produced such a major rupture was, according to the evidence, somewhere in the range of 500 years ago, and possibly longer for some sections. That means that for around 5 centuries, this large and dangerous fault has been sitting quietly, locked, and building strain. Let me explain a little more about how that detective work is done, because it is genuinely remarkable that we can know about earthquakes that happened before anyone was writing anything down. When scientists dig a trench across a fault, they expose a cross-section of the ground layer by layer like slicing through a cake. Each layer of sediment was laid down at a certain time in the past. When an earthquake ruptures the ground, it breaks and offsets those layers, and then new layers build up on top over the following years and centuries, sealing the break. So when a geologist looks at the wall of a trench and sees a layer that is cracked and shifted, with undisturbed layers sitting neatly on top of it, they are looking at direct evidence of an ancient earthquake. By collecting material from those layers and dating it using scientific methods, they can estimate when that earthquake happened. Do this at several sites along a fault, and you begin to build a history of its behavior stretching back thousands of years. This is how we know that the Garlock Fault is capable of large earthquakes, and how we know roughly how long it has been since the last big one. It also helps to understand what magnitude really means, because the numbers can be deceiving. Earthquake magnitude is measured on a scale where each whole number represents a dramatic jump in energy, not a small step. A magnitude 7 earthquake is not just slightly stronger than a magnitude 6. It releases roughly 30 times more energy. And a magnitude 8 releases about 30 times more than a 7, which means it is releasing hundreds of times more energy than a 6. This is why a fault capable of magnitude 7 or greater is such a serious matter. The difference between the moderate earthquakes that rattle windows and the great earthquakes that reshape lives is not a small one on this scale. It is the difference between a tremor and a catastrophe. When scientists say the Garlock is capable of magnitude 7 and above, they are describing a fault that can produce the kind of earthquake that a region remembers for generations. Let me put that into perspective, because it is the heart of why this matters. A fault that produces a big earthquake every few decades releases its energy regularly in manageable pieces. But a fault that goes hundreds of years between major earthquakes is a different kind of danger entirely. All that time, the plates keep moving. The strain keeps accumulating and the energy keeps building with nowhere to go. When a fault like that finally does release, it can do so with tremendous force. So when scientists say the Garlock Fault has been silent for 500 years, they are not describing a fault that is safe and inactive. They are describing a fault that has been quietly loading itself for a very long time. Now, to understand the recent concern, you need to understand the special relationship between the Garlock Fault and the San Andreas, because these two faults are connected in a way that makes them influence each other. They meet at a junction in an area of Southern California, and this junction is one of the most closely studied spots in the state. The two faults are different types. The San Andreas is what scientists call a right lateral strike slip fault, which simply means the two sides slide horizontally past each other in a particular direction. The Garlock is a left lateral strike slip fault, meaning its two sides slide horizontally in the opposite sense. Where these two great faults come together, the stresses in the Earth's crust become extremely complex. And critically, activity on one fault can change the amount of stress on the other. This is not just theory, it is one of the best established phenomena in earthquake science. When a large earthquake happens on one fault, it does not just release energy at that spot. It redistributes stress across the surrounding region, and that can load additional strain onto nearby faults, pushing them closer to their own breaking point. Scientists have documented this again and again. A well-known example in this very region happened when a powerful earthquake sequence struck the area around Ridgecrest in the Mojave some years ago. That earthquake did not occur directly on the Garlock Fault, but it happened close enough that, according to the calculations of the United States Geological Survey and other researchers, it increased the stress on the Garlock Fault. In effect, a big earthquake nearby gave the already loaded Garlock Fault an extra push toward rupture. After that event, scientists observed that Garlock Fault doing something it had not been documented doing before in the modern record. It appeared to show signs of creep and movement along parts of its length, a subtle shifting that suggested the fault was responding to the new stress it had received. So now bring it all together. You have a major fault that has been silent and storing energy for roughly 500 years. You have a nearby fault system that has been increasing the stress on it. And you have the fault's critical junction with the San Andreas, where the crust is under complex and intense strain. When new seismic activity occurs right at or near that junction, it naturally draws the attention of every geologist watching this region, because it may be another small signal in the long process of a fault approaching its limit. That is why recent earthquake activity in this exact area is treated as significant, even when the individual earthquakes are not themselves large. It is not the size of a single tremor that matters most. It is the location, the timing, and what it might be telling us about the changing balance of stress deep underground. Let me be very clear and very honest here, because that honesty is the foundation of everything I do. A small earthquake, Near the junction does not mean a big earthquake is about to happen. It does not mean anything is coming tomorrow or next week or next year. Faults can produce small quakes for many reasons, and most of the time they are just part of the normal background activity of a seismically active region. No scientist can look at a small tremor and predict a major earthquake from it, and anyone who claims they can is not being truthful with you. Earthquake prediction, in the sense of saying a specific quake will happen on a specific day, is simply not something science can do. What scientists can do is assess long-term risk, identify which faults are overdue and loaded, and watch for changes in the patterns of activity. And by every one of those measures, the Garlock Fault is a fault that deserves close attention. To really appreciate the potential here, consider what a major earthquake on the Garlock Fault could actually mean. Because this fault is capable of magnitude 7 and above, a full rupture would be a serious event. It would shake a wide area of Southern California. And here is a concern that adds another layer to the picture. The Garlock Fault runs close to and interacts with the southern San Andreas. Some scientists have studied the possibility that a large earthquake on one of these faults could, in certain circumstances, trigger or be linked to movement on the other. The idea of two great faults rupturing together or in quick succession is not the most likely scenario, and it is important not to overstate it. But it is a possibility that researchers take seriously enough to study, precisely because of how these faults are connected at that junction. Even on its own, a Garlock rupture would be a major event. In combination with the San Andreas, the effects could be far greater. This brings us to the southern San Andreas itself, which adds urgency to the whole picture. The southern section of the San Andreas Fault is considered by many scientists to be one of the most overdue major faults in California. Like the Garlock, its southern stretch has gone a long time without a great earthquake. The paleoseismic record suggests that this section has historically produced major earthquakes at intervals that, based on the time since the last one, means it too is well within the window where a large earthquake could occur. So you have two enormous loaded faults meeting at a single junction, both of which have been quiet for a long time, both of which are storing enormous amounts of energy. When you understand that, you understand why this particular corner of California is watched so intensely, and why activity there means so much more than activity in a random location. Let me walk you through what actually happens during and after a major earthquake on a fault like this, because understanding the mechanics helps you grasp why preparation matters so much. When the fault finally ruptures, the ground on the two sides of the fault shifts suddenly, sometimes by several meters. That sudden movement sends out seismic waves in all directions, traveling through the earth like ripples through water, though far faster and more powerful. These waves are what shake the ground beneath cities and towns. The shaking can last for many seconds, and in a large earthquake, that is more than enough time to cause tremendous damage. Buildings that are not designed to withstand it can crack, buckle, or collapse. Roads and bridges can be damaged, water and gas lines can break, power can go out across a wide area, but the initial shaking is only the beginning. After a major earthquake come the aftershocks, which are smaller earthquakes, triggered by the redistribution of stress from the main event. Aftershocks can continue for days, weeks, and even months, and while they are usually smaller than the main quake, they can still be strong enough to bring down already weakened buildings and hamper rescue efforts. Then there are the secondary effects. In areas with loose or water-saturated soil, strong shaking can cause the ground to temporarily behave almost like a liquid, a process called liquefaction, which can cause buildings to sink or tilt. In hilly areas, shaking can trigger landslides. And in a region as developed and populated as Southern California, the disruption to daily life, to transportation, to water supplies, and to the economy can be enormous and long-lasting. This is exactly why the science of watching these faults is so valuable, and why the researchers who study the Garlock and the San Andreas do work that genuinely protects lives. They cannot tell you the day an earthquake will strike. But by understanding which faults are loaded, how they interact, and what the long-term risks are, they help engineers design buildings that can survive strong shaking. They help authorities plan emergency responses, and they help all of us understand the ground we live on. Every trench they dig, every measurement of ground movement they take, every calculation of stress transfer between faults adds to a picture that makes the whole region safer over time, even if it can never make it perfectly safe. There's also something to be said about the way the Earth reveals its history to those who know how to look. When you drive through parts of Southern California, you can actually see the evidence of these faults written into the landscape. The mountain ranges, the valleys, the sudden changes in the terrain, many of these features exist because of millions of years of movement along these faults. The very shape of the land is a record of countless earthquakes over unimaginable spans of time. The Garlock Fault, in places, is visible as a line in the landscape, a boundary you can trace where the desert on one side meets different ground on the other. To a geologist, reading that landscape is like reading a book of the Earth's history, and that book tells us clearly that this fault has moved many times before and will move again. Before I give you the full summary, there is one more thing worth reflecting on, and it is the strange fact that a fault this important is so unknown to the public. Almost everyone in California has heard of the San Andreas. It appears in movies, in news stories, in conversations about the famous big one. But the Garlock, running right across the state and meeting the San Andreas at that critical junction, lives in near total obscurity by comparison. Why does that matter? Because public awareness is part of what keeps a region prepared. When people know a hazard exists, they build for it, they plan for it, they respect it. When a hazard is invisible in the public mind, it is easy to ignore, even by the people who live directly in its shadow. Part of the reason to talk about the Garlock at all is simply to move it out of obscurity and into the awareness it deserves, so that the millions of people who could one day feel it are not caught completely by surprise. It also helps to remember that Southern California is not a stranger to great earthquakes, even if living memory can make it feel that way. The historical and geological record contains evidence of very large earthquakes in this part of the world, including one enormous rupture of the San Andreas in the 1800s that tore across a huge length of the fault. That event happened in a time when the region was sparsely populated, so the human toll was limited. Today, the same ground is home to a vast number of people, sprawling cities, and critical infrastructure. A rupture of similar size striking the same region now would be a far more consequential event, not because the earthquake would be any larger, but because there is so much more in its path. This is the quiet truth behind all the scientific attention. The faults have not become more dangerous. We have simply built more of our lives on top of them. That combination of loaded faults and dense population is what turns a natural process into a serious human concern. So let me pull this all together into what really matters. First, the Garlock Fault is one of the largest and most significant faults in California, and yet it is one that most people have never heard of. Second, this fault has been silent, locked, and storing energy for around 500 years. And in the language of earthquakes, that long silence is a sign of accumulated risk, not of safety. Third, the Garlock meets the San Andreas at a critical junction where the crust is under intense and complex stress, and where activity on one fault can load additional strain onto the other. Fourth, a nearby major earthquake in recent years increased the stress on the Garlock and appeared to prompt movement along it, which is why scientists have been watching it more closely than before. And fifth, both the Garlock and the southern San Andreas are considered loaded and overdue, which makes this entire region one of the most important to watch in all of North America. And yet, with all of that said, I want to end on the same honest note I have carried throughout. None of this means an earthquake is imminent. None of this is a prediction. The Earth operates on timescales that dwarf human lifetimes, and a fault that has been silent for 500 years could remain silent for another 50, or it could rupture in our lifetime. Nobody knows, and nobody can know exactly when. What we can do is understand the risk, respect the forces at work beneath our feet, and prepare wisely. If you live in California, or anywhere that faces earthquake risk, that preparation is simple and it is worth doing. Know how to protect yourself during shaking, which experts summarize as drop, cover, and hold on. Secure heavy furniture and objects in your home so they cannot fall on you. Keep a basic emergency kit ready, with water, food that does not spoil, a flashlight, and a way to get information if the power goes out. Have a plan for how your family would reunite and communicate if an earthquake struck while you were apart. These steps do not require fear. They require only a clear-eyed respect for the reality of living on active ground. The Garlock Fault has been quiet for 500 years, but quiet is not the same as finished. Deep beneath the desert of Southern California, the plates keep moving, the strain keeps building, and this great silent fault continues to store the energy that it will one day release. When that day comes is beyond our knowledge, but that it will come eventually is beyond doubt. And the more we understand about this fault, and the sooner we prepare for the ground to move, the safer we all will be when it finally does. I will keep following the science of these faults and bringing you clear, honest updates as we learn more. If you found this valuable, let me know in the comments where you are watching from, and whether you have ever felt an earthquake yourself. Take care, stay prepared, and I will see you in the next one.